Please join me in prayer. O God, our great liberator, free our hearts that we may love as you love. Free our minds that we might imagine a society that reflects your kingdom. And free our lives that we might know ourselves connected to one another deeply and deeply connected to you. Amen. A few years ago, I was selected to serve as a juror in a criminal trial in Montgomery County. My fellow jurors and I were told that this was a carjacking case, and before us in the courtroom sat our defendant, a young black man with short dreadlocked hair in an ill-fitting suit. Over the course of 2 days, the prosecutor and defense attorney laid out the details of the case. An older man, lonely and unhoused, had not wanted to be alone on his birthday. So he convinced 2 younger men to celebrate with him by buying them alcohol and driving them around in his leased BMW. It was late in the evening when they encountered the defendant in our case in the parking lot of an apartment building. The 4 men hung out for a while, drinking and smoking marijuana, and then decided to go to McDonald's to get food. Because the defendant in our case was the most sober of the 4 of them, they asked him to drive. While in the drive-thru, though, the owner of the car became upset and agitated, and he got out of the car and ran away. The 2 young men who had spent the day with him decided to go after him in the car, and so the defendant who was driving the car got out. The next morning, the owner of the car woke up behind a gas station where he had passed out, and he called the police and told them that he had been carjacked. The police went to the apartment building, arrested the 2 men who had been with him that day, as well as the defendant in our case, whose only involvement in the whole situation had been to drive a car to McDonald's. My fellow jurors and I listened to witness testimony, including several police officers and detectives who had interviewed everyone in the case. We watched grainy video footage from the drive-through security camera at McDonald's, and we heard from the owner of the car and his version of the events of that night. We never heard directly from the defendant. Once all the evidence was presented, we were dismissed to a locked room to deliberate. And my fellow jurors and I pretty quickly came to consensus that the defendant in this case was not guilty of any crime. Poor judgment, perhaps, but that's not criminal. When we returned to the courtroom, our 4 women read our verdict to the judge. And we watched the defendant and his family burst into tears, overcome with relief that this young man would be free once more. And after everyone left the courtroom, the jurors were allowed to stay and ask the judge any questions that we had. It was then that we learned that this young man had spent the last 6 months in jail because he didn't have the money to pay his bond. We learned that because of this arrest, he had lost his job, causing a financial hardship to him and his family. And we learned that in order to have this charge removed from his record, he would have to go through a process with the court that would require more time and more money. The judge told us that he believed that we had made the right decision in this case. But I walked away feeling deeply conflicted about the long-term impact that this experience would have on this young man and the trajectory of his life, about the way it would impact his family and community. The system had worked the way it was supposed to, and yet there were so many things about it that felt unjust and unfair. United Methodist Resolution 5031 begins with this statement: "The biblical view of the criminal justice system is one that should be characterized by accessibility to all, impartiality, honesty, integrity, and fairness, without regard to status." This resolution draws upon our Old Testament reading from the book of Deuteronomy, among other verses, to cast this vision of justice. Deuteronomy is a book that is ascribed to Moses, and its Greek title means second law, because it describes the law that it was given to the Israelite people before they passed over the Jordan River into the land that their ancestors had promised to them. The first law, of course, was the one given to Moses on top of Mount Sinai, just after the people had been delivered from slavery in Egypt. Between the time of the first and second laws, 40 years, 2 generations, the people had been wandering in the wilderness. And Yahweh, through the leadership of Moses and Aaron, had been forming out of this band of refugees a chosen people who would be free in body, mind, and spirit, who would willingly commit to a covenant relationship with one another under the laws of God. Chapters 16 through 18 of Deuteronomy outline the structure of authority in the community of God and establishes various roles for public leadership, including judges. Judges who have the responsibility for administering God's law. The task of serving as a judge in ancient Israel would have been a difficult one to fulfill honorably. Bribery, corruption, and kinship loyalties were all a widespread part of the culture at that time. And so to establish a fair and impartial judicial system required not only good laws and judges who were willing to uphold them, but also prophets who would hold the judges and the entire system to accountability. And the same is true in our time and place, because this biblical view is far from the reality of the criminal justice system that we have in the United States today. According to the Sentencing Project, the United States is the world's leader in incarceration, with 2.2 million people currently in our nation's jails and prisons, a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Sentencing policies, implicit bias, and socioeconomic inequality contribute to racial disparities at every level of the criminal justice system. Today, people of color make up 37% of the U.S. population and 67% of the prison population. Overall, African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they are more likely to face stiff sentences. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Hispanic men more than twice as likely to be incarcerated as non-Hispanic white men. As Michelle Alexander writes in The New Jim Crow, the United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. In Washington, D.C., it is estimated that 3 out of 4 young black men, and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods, can expect to serve time in prison. And according to the ACLU, as of this week, nearly 127,000 incarcerated people have tested positive for COVID-19, and almost 1,000 have died. In addition to the racial and socioeconomic inequalities, mass incarceration is also a public health issue in this time of a global pandemic. United Methodist Resolution 5031 calls for prophets who will help reform and humanize our criminal justice system. cultivating compassion for our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, advocating for reforms that address racial and socioeconomic inequalities, treating those who have completed their sentences as our fellow citizens, and fully restoring their civil and human rights. And most of all, recognizing that how we treat those who have committed crimes and their families will have a wider impact on communities and our society at large. Because it says in the resolution, we cannot punish our way to a healthy society. As Christians, we follow Jesus, who himself was a victim of the inequities of the justice system in his place and time. Although he came as a prophet to critique the systems of economic and racial oppression of his culture, he came on behalf of God to remove the scales from our eyes so that we might see the injustice all around us. Yet when he was put on trial, the people chose a violent criminal to be released instead of Jesus. And Pilate, though he knew Jesus was innocent, still sentenced him to death. We can see in the arrest, trial, and execution of Jesus how many people were complicit in it. It was the complexity and pervasiveness of evil, from the religious and political authorities to the ordinary people in the crowd, all of whom turned their back on the human one and allowed him to be killed in the most gruesome way possible. And still, this human evil could not overcome God's love and compassion, God's desire for true justice and liberation for all of us, even the ones who had condemned God's only child to death. You see, all of us, as Walter Brueggemann writes, are in hoc. We are all debtors who need to be forgiven. And it is this awareness of our own culpability that is the ground of compassion for others, for our sisters and brothers and siblings who are caught up in a justice system which continues to hold them in bondage. All of us need to be liberated from our mindset of retributive justice and a system that perpetuates brokenness. Brian Stevenson writes in Just Mercy, "We are all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. We all share the condition of brokenness, even if our brokenness is not equivalent. I guess I'd always known, but never fully considered, that being broken is what makes us human. We all have our reasons. Sometimes we're fractured by the choices we make. Sometimes we're shattered by things we would have never chosen. But our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis of our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. Our shared vulnerability and imperfection nurtures and sustains our capacity for compassion. We have a choice. We can embrace our humanness, which means embracing our broken nature and the compassion that remains our best hope for healing. Or we can deny our brokenness, forswear compassion, and as a result, deny our own humanity. But simply punishing the broken, walking away from them or hiding them in plain sight only ensures that they remain broken, and we do too. There is no wholeness outside of reciprocal humanity. We have a choice in how we establish our systems of justice, in how we hold people to account for their crimes and seek safety and security in our communities. Organizations such as the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by Bryan Stevenson, have challenged the so-called three strikes laws and excessive punishment for nonviolent offenders, and have tried to outlaw the death penalty. Some criminal justice reform is happening in some places, but it is not enough. There is much work to do if we are to humanize a system that was set up to deny the humanity of some of us and has effectively denied the humanity of all of us. My time as a juror in Montgomery County was not my only experience of the justice system close up. About 15 years ago, my father was arrested and put in federal prison for 2 years. At the time he was arrested, he was struggling with mental illness, addiction, and homelessness. And he got involved in a scheme to help bring an undocumented immigrant across the southern border of the US in California. He'd been recruited by a coyote who would pay people like my father, down on their luck but possessing a US passport, to drive through the border checkpoint. When my father was convicted and sent to prison, it was his second offense. My dad, who was already in ill health, both physically and mentally, deteriorated significantly while incarcerated. And shortly after he was released, he died of heart failure at the age of 60. I share this story with you not for shock or for sympathy, but to help humanize this issue of criminal justice. My father was a broken person, and his time in prison broke him further. It's true that he committed a crime and that he knew what the consequences would be. But I wonder if we had a justice system that not only looked at a person's crime, but at the whole person, at their whole life, at all their struggles, and humanized them, cared for them, sought not only to punish, but to truly rehabilitate them, if things might have turned out differently. And not just for my father, but for every person convicted of a crime in this country. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. May we make it so. Amen.